Thank you, Kurt. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for being here this morning. We're here to present our project for this year on the Olympic Charter Rule 50. The team we have is Zhao Wang, Bernardo Palmeiras, and myself, Gibran Khan. The supervisor we had for this project was Jalimi Malakroa, and our client, as Chris mentioned, was Isabella from the IOC. The agenda for this presentation, we're going to give a quick introduction to our project, the mission of it, the methodology we used, our findings, and recommendations. So, before we got the project, we were trying to actually, when we were presenting the project, we were wondering what the Rule 50 was. So what is the Rule 50 of the Olympic Charter? We're still trying to find an easier name to associate that with, for everyone to understand it more easily. In the news recently, you would have seen these things, but that's not what we're going to be talking about this morning. Our focus is on the athletes, their clothing, their equipment that they use. So to summarize once again what we're looking at, so Rule 50 is about no advertising or publicity to be shown during the games. One of the key factors that differentiates the Olympic Games from other world championships is the fact that the clean venues. And for every Olympic Games, the IOC sends across a set of guidelines which we've reviewed and compared with the IF rules. Our mission was to research, so to simply explain it, we looked at the IF guidelines which were in there for the same purpose and compared it with what the IOC guidelines were before each of the games. From this comparison, we would find differences that were there, things that probably were better or could be improved for smoother implementation during games time. We also looked at another stakeholder in the whole scheme of things, which is the manufacturers. We look at more detail in terms of what are the things that are controlled, which make it difficult for the manufacturers prior to games. And in the end, to bring together the IF and IOC guidelines to make it as simple for both parties. So as I mentioned, we looked at the existing guidelines from the international federations. We looked at the guidelines which were there from London 2012. And we divided it for athletes, coaches, officials, technical staff, and looked at it what's applicable for only the Summer Olympic Games. The methodology we used was considering things were fairly, reviewing of existing guidelines and literature. We looked at the IOC guidelines and the regulations. We then looked at the next level, which was what specifications within the guidelines were being or were different from each other. So we found the national identification, athlete information, which we'll again look into more detail a little later. And of course, having meetings, so as the opinion was only taken from the client and an external client, which was the WFSGI, the Manufacturers Association, sporting goods, and meetings with the client to be able to review and see if we were going in the right direction. That's it from an introduction point of view. What we did to start off with was we divided all of the federations among the three of us. We classified them as red, amber, and green for no other purpose, but simply for us to be able to look at where there are more differences and where we can they're fairly consistent with what's already there. We also looked at feedback from London 2012, the debrief, and saw what was the kind of challenges they faced in those games, what the IFs had to say about it. So we found that there were obviously 4 in red and a split of 11 each among the amber and green. I will pass you over to Zhao to explain the findings in detail from here on. Thank you.
Thanks, Srikanth. And let me continue with findings. After the research on the IOC guidelines and the 28 IF regulations, we found that IOC guidelines are more generic, whereas the IF regulations are relatively specific. And the IOC guidelines fully follow the essence of the Rule 50 of the Olympic Charter and its bylaws. And in the guidelines, there are two parts. In Part A, there are general principles. And in Part B, there is specific implementation which gives us sport-by-sport regulations. But this regulation follows a similar structure and gives the similar instructions, which cannot fully meet the need of different sport. But for the IF regulations, it is mainly based on the different features of different sports, so it's more specific. And IOC guidelines can also be defined as one size fits all. For example, in the guidelines, the size of the logo is limited to a standard of 20 square centimeters on clothings and 6 square centimeters on accessories. But for the IF regulations, we have a large variety of dimensions for different identification. And the major differences between the IOC guidelines and IF regulations lie in 3 areas. They are accessories and equipment, national identification, and athlete information. In terms of the accessories and the equipment, we find that IOC guidelines is relatively less specific than some of the IF regulations. And we found in for 5 IF, we have more permissive regulations in this regard. As for the national identification, in the IOC guidelines, the national identity is defined as the NOCs are encouraged to use their national colors, flags, emblems, as well as the national NOC emblems to visually enhance their national identity of the items. But according to debriefing after the game, some IFs recommend that such generic regulations cannot fully solve the problems during the games. But for the national identities, most IF give very specific regulations on size and place. For example, after the research, we found that 12 IFs give us specific regulations on their national identifications in terms of how much, the size of it, and where to place it. And 4 IFs give generic regulations on national identity. 12 IFs do not mention anything about the national identification. And another common issues recurred in both our comparative analysis and the debriefing after the game is the athlete information, which means the athlete's names and the competitive number and base, etc. And after reviewing the IF regulations, we find that 11 IFs have very specific regulations on the athlete information, and 2 give generic ones. 14 do not mention anything about their athlete information. Then I'll pass the floor to Bernardo to give us an example of our comparative analysis.
Thank you, so basically, since the biggest part of our work was to compare the IF's regulations with the IOC guidelines, we decided to create this worksheet where we could insert all the information that to be easily used by the IOC, the sports department, our client, when they will decide to create the next guidelines and to see where are the differences. So basically, we started by using the IOC guidelines and the information provided by there. So the IOC guidelines, the information you can see here, what they have on a sport-by-sport situation, and what we can find from what we have in the IOC guidelines in the regulations. In some situations, we have a lot of information. In some situations, sometimes we barely had something to insert here regarding the IF regulations. This is, for example, the example of the FIBA basketball. And well, they are like a federation that in our previous slides, they were considered as green. The only thing that they really claim, for example, is that they would like to have their logo in clothing, which is something that it's different from sponsoring or advertising or even logo, so something that we really didn't really address. So basically this was our work during almost the 7 months. To do the research, to compare, and basically to insert it here so we can show our client. From this we reached some conclusions. Obviously the idea here is not to change the essence of Rule 50, so no sort of advertising will be allowed, and that's something that we don't think should change. But we stand in favor of having guidelines adapted to a sport-by-sport situation. It's not that every sport will change or that the guidelines need to address every sport individually, but we found that there are some sports that have very specific regulations, and that changing after 4-year basis to adapt can be problematic and can, force them to change a lot from the manufacturer perspective and from the brands involved with their sport. So I think that if the IOC had a chance to address this subject, the guidelines on a sport-by-sport situation, they would easily find a way to maybe tackle some problems and to avoid having then problems at games time. And basically the general idea is that we think they should have a similar base applied, but to a sport-by-sport situation according to the nature of the sport, and helping athletes, brands, manufacturers, so all the stakeholders involved. And I think this would give, at the games time, easier time to the IOC. So we finally end some of our recommendations after reaching some of the conclusions. So, as mentioned before, ENCO passed more sport-specific rules in the IOC guidelines. Obviously then, this was said before as well, a lot of IF regulations have national identification treated separately. I think that this is easy to identify and easy to treat, so during our 7 months we talked a lot about it as well, so it's something that, it's a simple recommendation, but it's something that I think will help some sports. And also the athlete information number, his name, you have some sports that also are very, very specific regarding this information, and the guidelines have normally nothing specific about it. From the operational process, that I think that will be the major recommendation and something that will in the future help. We know that sports department is already working on a process that involves all the stakeholders so they can reach some conclusions faster and prior to the game. So to start with the pre-game education. Some of the federations in the debrief of the London 2012, they asked to be informed about the guidelines previously, to have more time to talk with their federations. Some sports have a lot of federations involved, allow the federations to talk with their sponsors and so on and so forth. So basically they could have more time to comply with. So maybe even a pre-game education, something even prior to the guidelines would be interesting, talking with the federations directly, even following the debrief, have some direct contacts that could help to analyze and tackle the problems of the previous games. And this is a little bit what I was talking about, the tool. Somehow involve federations, the World Federation of Sports Industry that's somehow representing the manufacturers in the submission process, so that if the IOC has a chance to identify the problems previous to the manufacturing, then they can already propose some changes and it will be easily changed to the games. And during game remediation, we saw the pictures as well with the tapes, and it's very hard to define and to find a solution to this, but I think that obviously some recommendation that should be, maybe our recommendation, we talked also about it, would be having a brand associated with the IOC that could somehow provide simple, no brands equipments that could help to tackle these situations where you can find that the IF did not comply, so they will not be able to use their equipment.